Welcome to the Power of Words LinkedIn Live, whether you're watching now or the recording at another time. Today's topic is interview techniques for killer content. You see, the way we interview, the questions we ask or don't ask, more importantly, can really make the difference between good or just mediocre content. And if you're not interviewing to create content, then why on earth not? It's a great way to get fresh insight and diverse perspectives, often from independent experts who really know their stuff. You're more likely to get your audiences interested and for them to trust you more as well. And these days, of course, if you do a good interview, the video content can go on social too. It's a win-win. But really, it's all about acting like a journalist. And on that note, let me introduce you, for some of you again, to my guest, seasoned presenter, moderator, and Emmy-nominated journalist, Hannah Vaughan-Jones. Hannah, welcome.
Thank you, Tessa. It's an absolute honour and privilege to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Well, Hannah, I'm sure many people will recognise you from the telly, but just as a quick reminder, please tell us a bit more about you.
So I was with CNN for about 5 years or so as one of their primetime anchors based out of the London office on CNN International predominantly. And before that, I was with Sky News as well as a presenter there in the UK. And now I'm a professional moderator, so I go all over the world working with private public sector clients, the likes of UN agencies, WHO, IAEA and the like, and also private clients as well, companies and foundations, philanthropic foundations and the like. And I'm very, very privileged in that I get to sort of parachute into all of these different worlds and businesses and the like, and ask questions, ask very, very simple questions to get some really, really fruitful answers, which is much more than you get when you're doing a broadcast interview on TV, because you normally only get about 4 minutes. And now in my life now, I get about half an hour to ask questions, which is wonderful.
Total indulgence. And simple questions for fruitful answers is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Yeah. How to ask really clever but simple questions and get some fantastic content out of it. Just quickly, for those watching live, please do add questions in the comment section along the way. If we don't get to them during the live, we will be sure to get back to you offline at some point today or certainly this week. So Hannah, let's start the interview proper. Tell me about your all-time favourite interview moment and why.
Well, I've been, for my sins, or perhaps I should just say, again, I'm hugely privileged in that I've interviewed the last 3 British Prime Ministers, which didn't actually happen over a long period of time, because as most of you will know, then there's been quite a lot of Prime Ministers in the last couple of months. But in 2019, I was very lucky to be doing the Conservative Party leadership hustings, which was at the time between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt, who was then Foreign Secretary. He's obviously now Chancellor. And it wasn't necessarily my all-time favourite moment, because, Tessa, as you'll know, most journalists, their favourite moment will be a time when they got an amazing breaking news line out of an interview. This wasn't so much a breaking news line, but I was sitting down with Boris Johnson in Doncaster, I think, somewhere up north in the UK. And I asked him if there was a moment, or could he think of a moment in his political life when he'd put he sacrificed his own personal self-interest for the good of the country. And his response to that was a very sort of mumbling kind of answer, when essentially he said that as a politician, you don't earn as much money as you could if you were, out on the speaking trail or in the private sector. So essentially, he kind of said it ended up going viral on the internet. But he said that his great sacrifice to the British public was in becoming a politician and therefore earning slightly less than he would if he was just let loose to go and speak all over the world, which of course he's since gone and done. So it was just a really nice moment, and something that certainly got picked up by the press.
How we miss his TV bloopers. Now for some personal candor. So everyone knows that you aren't superhuman, even though you are a TV presenter. Have you had any interview experiences that you'd rather just forget about? And importantly, what have you learned from them?
Yes, one moment that really stands out was back in 2018, and I was hosting a big global health event on the sidelines of the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which happened to be in London. So I was on stage at the time with Bill Gates, then Prince Charles, obviously now King Charles, various UN leaders, and about 15 heads of government, mostly African states within the Commonwealth. And the idea was that we were going to have a drone take off out of the palm of Bill Gates, and take off into the sky and then take a picture of us all on stage or something. And I knew beforehand, I thought, this is not going to work. The technology is going to fail. I'm going to be on stage with the founder of Microsoft and the technology is going to fail. And sure enough, it did. So Bill is stood there with this drone in his hand that's not moving. There's complete silence, an audience of about 1,000 in person, and goodness knows how many more thousands were watching virtually as well. And I had to fill, and I had nothing prepared or anything. So I made a joke about the fact that one of the greatest tech leaders in the world was having a mammoth fail on stage in front of the world. And the wonderful thing about it, the biggest lesson for me, was that in that moment, I felt an enormous sense of leveling out, not leveling up, leveling out. So it was that moment of, it doesn't matter if you're a president, it doesn't matter if you're a prince, if you're a king, if you're the wealthiest person in the world, I belong on this stage as well with you because I've been invited here. And that stayed with me ever since. So I had that crushing moment of wanting the stage to swallow me up for about 10 seconds, which felt like a lifetime. But then we made light of it. And actually, it was just funny. I got a little laugh out of Prince Charles, and everyone else thought it was amusing as well. And I think that's the most important thing when you go into any interview setting. And I've certainly done this ever since, is to feel like I belong here. This is not embarrassing. These people are not more important than me, or not more clever than me. And obviously, most of the time they are, but we all belong here on this stage. And that's been hugely useful. So out of failure came enormous success in a way.
Try not to let that imposter syndrome slip in, I suppose. So let's get on to some tips then, tips of the trade when it comes to interviewing and questioning to create great content. As I said in my introduction, more people than ever before are having to channel their inner journalist in the name of creating content. So I'm going to call on you now for some insider information. Let's start with preparation. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows you have to prepare for an interview. You'd be mad not to. You're not going to wing it, are you? But people don't have all the time in the world. So how do you prepare for interviews in a way that's not overwhelming and, importantly, creates those refreshing questions and questioning?
Well, I think the coming up with the questions, or having an idea of how you want the questions to flow, is the most important thing. Fundamentally, all journalists know this because we're taught it in journalism college, but every question you will ever ask or be asked will be a version of who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so if you can start in your mind, in your preparation, answering those questions, thinking, what's the who, what's the where, what's the what, what's the why, and the how, and then you're already off to a really good start. I would also say that it's how you ask questions, and is important. There are open questions and there are closed questions, and both are really, really valuable. So open questions demand a little bit more than just a monosyllabic answer, for example. So you could say something like, how did that make you feel? And therefore the person in question will have to sort of like give a bit more detail. Or it can be like, are you going to change that policy? Which is a closed question, and both are really useful. I would tend to start any interview with an open question, and also throw in a couple of closed questions. An example of that would be, Liz Truss, when she was Prime Minister recently, she in various interviews with the BBC, for example, she had lots of open questions. How do you think people feel about this? What are you going to do about that to actually make a difference in people's lives? And then thrown a couple of closed questions as well. Are you going to reverse your top rate of tax policy? No, was the answer. And sure enough, whatever it was, 12 hours later, she changed it. So it's important to use both open and closed questions, but fundamentally I would stick with who, what, where, when, why, and how, and have an idea in your mind about what the answers might be to that.
And actually, you mentioned sort of monosyllabic answers there, and we did have a question sent in from Jess Watson, who I can see is also live watching now, about how do you tackle those monosyllabic answers. So it's not the ones where people are deliberately using it as a tactic, let's say, but they think they want to be interviewed, but then when the moment comes, they're a bit like a rabbit caught in headlights, or they don't really know what to say, and you do get those monosyllabic answers. How do you tackle that? Because it is awkward, isn't it?
It is super awkward. most people who obviously who have been invited on to be interviewed will know that they need to give more than just one answer, one word answers. But having said that, people can have brain fog suddenly, rabbit caught in the headlights, or just be having an off day. In the first case, I would always encourage them, give them the benefit of the doubt and encourage them just reframe your question. So ask the same question again, but say something like, can you just give us a little bit more detail there on how you would go about doing that? Again, an open question, and look at them as well. Difficult to do if you're doing it online, but if you have them in person and right next to you, look at them, encourage them. I always kind of like make eye contact with people, nod along, and I use my hands quite a lot as well. You're trying to sort of literally draw out an answer from them as well. So it's about being as inclusive, as warm, as authentic, and give them the benefit of the doubt. And first off, if they still only give you a one word answer, then your interview is the most important thing. And so if you have another guest on your panel or whatever the setup might be, I would move on then and ditch that person and move on quickly to the next person and hope that maybe you can go back once they've found their tongue or something. And if it is just one person and they only give one word answers and you have no one else to go to, then I would just wrap it up. And fundamentally it's not an interview if you haven't got any content out of it. So maybe you can rearrange it or just never speak to that person again.
Delete them from
delete.
And you mentioned online then, which most of the listeners today will be doing online interviews, so we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But I suppose also what you were talking about just then is about sort of building rapport, and this is a question that's come in before the live from Fiona Adams, that how do you put your interviewees at ease? Because it is a bit of a fine balance, isn't it, between being too relaxed and too friendly versus sort of, being too stiff and too formal, and the whole thing's, you don't get the most out of each other, really.
Yeah, well, I always think where possible, where protocol doesn't exist, use first name terms and use that person's first name through the interview as well. It's disarmingly charming. If I'm interviewing someone from a TV studio and they use my name back at me and say, well, Hannah, yes, it's lovely. You feel like you're sort of sitting down for a coffee with a pal. So that's a really nice way to build rapport. It makes them feel more at ease as well. Be transparent beforehand about what kind of things you're going to ask, unless you're going with a politician, obviously, in which case don't tell them anything. Hope for the best. But if you are, trying to get some really good, valuable content out of that interview, which of course you will be trying to do, then, make sure that they are well briefed beforehand. Don't give them word for word your exact questions, because fundamentally no one's a robot and you almost certainly won't be reading your questions from an auto cue or anything like that. So they will fall out of your mouth however they fall out of the mouth. But if you encourage your interviewee to think of it as a conversation, and give them a broad range of, we'll cover these topics, and also ask them beforehand if there are any red flags, if there are any no-go areas as well, just so it means that they're not nervous about what might come up and you're well briefed as well on what you should and shouldn't ask them as well.
I have a question. If I'm very clever, I will be able to put it up on screen. There we go, from 𝗵𝗲 𝗣𝗏. Do you make a lot of notes as you interview to refer back to? And I suppose that's sort of adding another question onto that question from 𝗵𝗲. If you do make notes, how do you handle that? Because that's a whole lot of stuff going on at one time, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't make a lot of notes. I definitely always have, I'm quite old school about it, I will always have pen and paper. I know some people can be very fancy with tablets and all sorts of things, but I'm quite old fashioned about it. I always make sure I have a pen and paper to be able to scribble down mostly just keywords or phrases just to trigger my memory, because often what happens is that you will come up with a beautifully formed question in your head that absolutely perfectly encapsulates what that person's just said, but then they've gone on for another 30 seconds and they've slightly moved on and you're like, oh, I need to kind of get back to that brilliant question, what was it? And then by this time you're not listening. So I would just note down the phrase, whatever it might be, circular economy or green energy or something like that. And if I've got a couple of interviewees, then I would just put their name next to it or an arrow pointing to them if they're in front of me as well. So yes, not a lot of notes. The problem with making a lot of notes especially if you can't do shorthand, which most people can't, I can't, is that as soon as you start writing out full sentences, you are therefore not engaged in the conversation and you are not listening.
And actually, taking notes. Thank you, Gemma. Let me see if I can try and get rid of the question. There we go. Taking notes, I suppose, it brings me on to the next question, which is all about listening. Really difficult to truly listen when you're interviewing someone, but so important. I mean, I was that journalist age 22 where I was so frightened about my next question, remembering it and doing it well, that I didn't really listen to what someone, if I'm really honest, to what the person was saying. And you're never going to create good content and get a good interview if you're not truly listening. So, you know, how do you do it? Listening, remembering what you're doing, dilemma.
Well, I think it all comes down to practice and confidence as well. Listening is the single most important thing to do, and I would say the hardest thing to do as well. But it is so important. If you are prepped and confident about your subject matter and about the interview, then you can actively listen. So you're kind of, again, making eye contact, you're nodding your head, you're physically in listening as well, actively listening to them. And then you can pick up on maybe the last thing that they've just said or something interesting that they've just said in their answer, and then ask them about that. Now, it might not be your beautifully prepared order of questions, but you need to have the confidence to maybe go there, because, you know, however well you've briefed your interviewee beforehand, they will always end up, if you've got A, B, C, D, E, they will always end up you'll start on A, and before you know it, they're talking about D or E, and you're like, well, no, I don't want to talk about that for another 20 minutes. So you've just got to be, in my opinion, fluid and flexible emaugh to be able to jump around a bit. So don't have a fixed order of questions, just have maybe kind of some bullet point notes on under thematic areas. If you're really struggling to listen, which most people really do, the one trick of the trade, I would say, is that if nothing else, listen to the last sentence or the last thing that that person has just said and pick out one word from there and use it back at them. It makes them feel heard. It makes them feel like you have been listening, even if you've only listened to the last 5 seconds. But it keeps it conversational. It keeps the conversation going, keeps the momentum in the interview, and it makes that person feel like you know, that they're saying some good stuff and that you're enjoying it.
Absolutely. And trying to practice what I preach here, also to make them feel like, you know, you're enjoying it. I find that one of the most important parts of the whole interview can sometimes be that final question where you specifically ask your interviewee, have you got anything else to add that we haven't talked about? This may be less for sort of TV interviews because you've got, you know, it's a very time specific, limited window. But, you know, when you're trying to come up with those interesting angles, I do find that, and finally, you know, question or, you know, what else would you like to add can be really sometimes the whole story or the whole angle that you haven't talked about the rest of the interview. Have you got any experiences with that, or is that something that you would agree with?
Well, I mean, again, in TV interviews, you just never have the time to sort of like just say, right, anything else you want to add to this? Because you normally got 3 minutes and that's it. So you've probably got about 2 questions total. I would say that I agree with the and finally, it gives them the opportunity to maybe go back over things that they didn't say quite as beautifully as they prepared beforehand. So that gives them the chance to do that. I think also the problem with the and finally is that if you say, you know, and finally, if you've got anything else to add, particularly say on the circular economy, and you weren't listening 10 minutes ago when they gave you a very, very thorough answer on the circular economy, then that, you know, that can be a bit awkward as well. So if you are going to use that and finally, either use it in a very smart way, which means you can say, you know, for sure that they haven't touched on this one, you know, bonds a bit of information that you absolutely want to have in there, in which case you can say, you know, we haven't yet touched on the circular economy. I don't know why I'm talking about circular economy so much, but anyway.
You do like the circular economy.
We haven't yet touched on that. So finally, before we conclude, you want to just add your thoughts on that, whatever it might be. But just be careful, because if you give them a specific topic and they're like, well, yeah, well, as I said before, you know, that can make you look a bit weak or not silly, but it can just sort of shift the balance a bit out of your favor if you ask them something that they've already answered.
Absolutely. We've talked about, some no-nos when it comes to interviews, like over-familiarity. Is there anything else that you would say is an absolute no-no when it comes to interviews?
I think over familiarity is a really interesting one, because there's a balance to be struck. What you want to do is make sure that you're comfortable and equal players, as I mentioned before about being on stage with Bill Gates, etc. But the over familiarity can be problematic when it makes it sound like you're too pally with that person, and it's quite an exclusive chat that is not very accessible to the wider audience as well. So it happens a lot in America, that I don't know, Oprah or something like that interviewing Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, and you could tell that they kind of like probably had dinner together every other day, and they're live their neighbours and all the rest of it, which was nice to see, to get an insight, but it was very, very exclusive. It was very much kind of like just their little niche bubble, and everyone else was kind of like watching it. I mean, that's a strange example in that it's obviously royalty and Meghan Markle, but I would say don't be overly familiar. Make sure that you make your content as accessible as possible to as wide an audience as possible, particularly because it's often going to be repurposed, as you say, for video can be repurposed then for social media and all the rest of it. You don't know how it's going to be cut up. It could be edited down to a 15-second soundbite from that guest, or it could run full length. So just try and be as professional as you can be, and you can be enthusiastic and friendly, and I think that's really important. Smiling is absolutely vital, even if it's a devastatingly sad, difficult topic. You don't have to smile with a giddy smile like this. It can be about smiling through your eyes, and is about being enthusiastic and passionate about your topic. And that's the most important thing. If you're not interested or passionate about the subject matter, you cannot expect anyone else to be as well. So you really need to ham it up. It's all about a level of performance.
And this applies perhaps even more so online, doesn't it? Now, we mentioned online just briefly earlier, and most people watching today will be interviewing online, but it is difficult, isn't it? That distance, the cameras, the kind of, not being in the same place. We've all had to do a lot of Zoom interviewing, perhaps moderating, perhaps podcast hosting, perhaps literally just simple interviews to create content. But it's so important to get right. So what are the do's and don'ts specifically of online interviews, if you have any do's and don'ts?
Well, I mean, like now, I'm terrible at looking at my actual camera when I'm doing online moderation interviews and the like. So this would be me actually making, say, eye contact with people, but I'm far too distracted by the fact that I can see us on the screen sort of a couple of inches below. So you're never really going to be able to make eye contact with people, which is tough. Because that's my sort of biggest weapon in my arsenal when I'm with people in person. So it's all about, I guess, again, smiling, making sure that you're comfortable in your environment, and hope that they are comfortable in their environment as well. So you might have people who are kind of like running along, wherever, and it's just not a great place for them to be concentrating and focusing on the subject matter. Hopefully you can get that sorted in the sort of the briefing chat that you might have beforehand when you're setting up the interview. Again, in your preparation, just find out where they're going to be and make them feel at ease before you actually press record and start the interview. And I would say, from an aesthetic perspective as well, I always dress from the toe up. I think it's really, really important. So because we're only seeing this much, the tendency is to put your slippers on or something like that, and fine, it's winter, it's cold, I get it, but there is something that changes in your body. Motion is emotion, emotion is motion, and so if you can properly dress for the part, you will perform better as well. So I actually do have, there you go, actually got heels on to be sitting in my home office as well. But it just makes me, I know that my voice is better. I know that I perform better when I am dressed from the toe up. So it's just a little tip for online hosting.
Well, that's so interesting. I'm not going to show you my shoes because I am gym ready, half, waist down. But anyway, I will certainly give that a go next time. So talking about presentation, actually, so it's sort of how you turn up to the interview and present yourself really sets the tone. We've talked about just briefly, aesthetically, but it's also just how you present, as a person. I suppose a lot is to do with confidence, and you talked about motion is emotion. Are there any other tips for how to, because it can, even though it's online, it can feel separate, it is still a nerve-wracking experience, especially if you're not a journalist, but you're having to do it as part of creating this great content.
Well, I mean, know your environment is a really important thing to do. On the aesthetic front, I would always say, and whether this is in person or online for that matter, try and avoid too sort of like navies and blacks and greys and things like that. You don't have to sort of come out in fuchsia pink, which I tend to do quite a lot. No shrinking violet here, but anyway. Block colour works really well. Always be aware of the fact that even if you are doing an interview in person, often things are being filmed so that they can then be repurposed for future use in various forms of content. And if you are wearing patterns or stripes or anything like that, that tends to strobe, which is just really distracting for the audience, for the viewer. So try and wear, block colours. Have water around you. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. Have makeup, men and women. There's nothing worse than seeing sweaty men on stage. And women for that matter as well. And more often than not, if you are in an interview setting, even if you're not on a stage of any sorts, you will have a bright light on you. I mean, I have a bright light on me right now, and you end up just being hot. And also if you're stressed in any way, again, this is one of the things that you need to know about physically, how your body physiologically reacts to being in an interview mode. People tend to get hot and when they're stressed or when they're nervous. Similarly, just be aware of what happens to your voice if you're really cold or something like that. You might end up being really high pitched, or you might end up talking really, really quickly, or be very, very monotone and low and down here as well. So there are things you can do to best prepare yourself, because things will always change last minute. And I suppose that's the main crux of this. With any interview, you will either they don't show up on time, or suddenly a fire alarm goes off somewhere, or there's an ambulance goes past, or whatever it might be. Or your internet connection goes down, you have to reschedule, or you do something a bit later, or that person is suddenly sick, or they've had a family bereavement, they can't make it, their substitute comes in and sits in, and you don't know anything about them at all. You have to be able to roll with it and go with all of the flex that will inevitably play into it as well. So all you can do is prepare yourself as best as possible, and that will be in how you look, how you feel, how you sound, and how much prep you've done in terms of the material.
Now, absolutely. Now, just finally, I did promise that we'd tell people listening how to be bolder instead of beige with their interviews, and I think it's a great place to end, and we are definitely running out of time. If it's not someone's forte or their natural territory, how can people be brave enough to be bolder in interviews?
Well, I mean, interviews are no longer just the domain of journalists and the media. Everyone needs to create good content for their business or for their brand. And therefore, it doesn't matter if you're naturally introverted or what your personality type might be. Everyone can create good content, and should as well. There's no point in doing anything unless you're going to sort of do it well. And fundamentally, you deserve to be on that stage. You deserve to be holding that mic or running that interview, or being the interviewer, because you've set it up. So have confidence in your right to be there. And there's no point in doing something meekly, I don't think. So being bold about it comes through practice, yes. But fundamentally, you need to, if the more you put in, the more you will get out. And if you're enthusiastic and you're passionate or urgent or whatever the kind of the rush through the body is that gives you the best kind of like question, the short, really succinct, good, strong question, you will get the best content then out of your interviewee as well. And even if that means asking, I think the shortest questions are absolutely the best. Literally like a why. Great. Absolutely brilliant. Let the silence sit and just indulge in it, and let the interviewee fill the space. That's what they're there to do. But it does come with a bit of confidence that everyone can and should create bold, positive content as well that can be repurposed for your various uses as well. It's not just for the likes of me and you to sort of go around interviewing people. And be curious. Fundamentally, you're doing interviews because you want answers. That's what journalists are always told. You've got to always be asking questions. Why? Be curious about it. So you might know all the answers or think you know what that person's going to say. But if they haven't given you quite enough, then just be curious. Ask again. Don't be shy about it. Just be bold and be confident, knowing that this is what you're going to be using for your future and your business.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Some really excellent tips in there. And I hope that everyone who's been listening or will listen at a future date will be armed and ready for combat. For me, I really love let the silence sit. That's a really nice thought. And also wear stilettos, even at home. We'll try that out next time. So thank you so much. Of course, do get in touch if you'd like to discuss anything we've been chatting about. Hannah, can you let people know how to get in touch with you, perhaps your website address, and I'll also post it with the recording.
Great. Yes. So my website is www.𝗵𝗲𝗄𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 all the emails and addresses and all that are all to be found there.
Fantastic. And if you'd like to know more about the power of words, do get in touch with me, 𝗏𝑃owerofwords.co.uk. And we will get on to all those unanswered questions. I've got a few that were sent in earlier as well. For now, thank you to everybody for tuning in. Thanks again to Hannah, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.